Pardon me?
You gotta introduce yourself.
Yeah. What the guy say?
Let me just say one thing.
The speaker needs no introduction.
Before he introduces himself, this is our last program for this season, but we will start again in the middle of January. I think it's the 15th or something. Anyway, like the second or third week. And I'll put it in the page and I'll email you. And in the meantime, lots of holiday fun ahead, so enjoy it.
Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome. Mike.
All right. Well, this program seemed like it would be appropriate given the news and all the blogs about tax reform and non-reform and so on. So there we are, tax reform 2017, although it might be 2019 before anything gets passed, and it will be at least 100 years before it makes a difference. Now, I thought before you start talking tax reform, you really ought to know what we have now before you start talking about changing it. And the gross domestic product of the United States is approximately $18.6 trillion. I suppose a lot of that has to do with inflation, why it's so much higher than it used to be. And the total federal, state, and local revenues come to about $6.6 trillion, which equals 33% of the gross domestic product, which it has been about that for 20 years or something. It's been in that neighborhood. Now, I'm going to give you a source of this thing because I found conflicting, and everything I tell you is from the internet. And I found a number of conflicting statistics, but according to the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, which sounds important, Social Security and Medicare are about $1.1 trillion, which would be 6% of the gross domestic product. And if you exclude those payroll taxes, which is where we get the funds for Social Security and Medicare, we would have 27% of the gross domestic product. And the reason I think it might make more sense to subtract Social Security and Medicare is because it's really more like a forced retirement account. And in a way, your employer is required to pay half of the contributions and so on. And I wish I could say it was exactly like an individual retirement account, but the people who pay in, when it comes to collecting back, the people who pay in the most get the least back in proportion to what they paid in, right? So I can't say it's exactly like an individual retirement account, but it's more like that than a regular tax where they just tax from one group of people and then they pay it out as they see fit. Now, if we look at the pie chart, we see that, and I believe this is, and I kept looking and looking, and I'm 99% sure that 40% of all revenue, this is federal, state, and local, comes from the individual income tax, which on this pie chart is the largest one. And the second largest, of course, are the payroll taxes, Social Security, Medicare. Then 21% of all the revenue is ad valorem, which means it has to do with, Rodney could say it.
No, I was just saying,
Yeah, has to do with taxing the value of something. So the real estate tax is an ad valorem tax because it taxes the value of the real estate. A sales tax is an ad valorem tax because it taxes the value of the purchase. An import tax, tobacco, gasoline, anything that taxes a product based on the value of the product is an ad valorem tax. I don't know exactly what the Latin translation is. All right. So basically it's real estate taxes, and I understand it's about 10% of the total income, total tax revenue is from real estate, and so I suppose maybe another 10% or close to it would be a sales tax. A lot of states have sales taxes. 8% fees. I suppose when you go to the motor vehicle, it's a license fee, and if you get a building permit, it's a fee, and I guess all kinds of fees. And 8%, that seems like quite a bit of money for fees, and then business. And I kept searching and searching, and best that I can figure out that 7% on business includes the corporate income tax, gross receipts tax, net profits tax, all these taxes they have in Philadelphia, for example. You know all about it probably. You have to pay them. Trying to think. One time I remember thinking there were 9 different taxes that any business had to pay in Philadelphia. And including real estate taxes on businesses is all in that 7%. And PolitiFacts.com says that the corporate income tax is 1.6% of the gross domestic product, or 4.5% of total taxes. Now it's funny, but in this last week or so, when they've been talking about tax reform, how much wasted time they've spent talking about this horrible corporate income tax that's so high, and how it's going to ruin the country if we don't lower it, and it's going to kill jobs and so on.
And where's the estate tax and all that?
Pardon me?
And where's the estate tax?
Oh, I'm getting to that. Yeah. Well, the estate tax must be in ad valorem taxes.
Yeah.
In the revenue side.
Yeah.
Now on the spending side, and all these 2 charts come from the U.S. government revenue, the first one, and this one's U.S. government spending.com. 24% other, God knows what is included in that, but that's a hell of an other, isn't it? Usually you see a little sliver for other, but anyway, the highest one on here is healthcare. Now, talk about charts deceiving you. We're talking about healthcare. We're talking about all the Medicare, all the Medicaid, all the VA health benefits, and all the health benefits of every employee of every government, from the county, cities, to the federal. So to me, it's kind of meaningless. But you notice it's the largest expenditure. Well, sure. And then pensions, which includes Social Security, but also all the government pensions that are paid out, and military pensions. I don't know what percentage of the military retire and get a pension, but that's a lot. Education, 15%. That's a lot, isn't it? And defense is only 12%. But when you consider the United States has spends on the military almost as much as every other country in the world combined. I think it's like 8 or 9 largest militaries in the world. That's pretty amazing.
Within the 24% of all, how many black programs that are militarily oriented are in that don't show up?
Oh yeah, in the other. Yeah.
But that's also all just, that 12% comes strictly out of the federal part of the pie. No, I don't think.
Yeah, I have a feeling that even the National Guards are not funded by state and local taxes. Yeah, that's a good point, isn't it? All federal. And then you get 6% welfare, and you might, if you didn't think about it for a second, think that that was for real. But Medicaid is welfare, but it's in this other chart of healthcare. And food stamps are clearly welfare, and they probably come out of that other. And so I suspect that it's a whole lot more. And in fact, some estimates are that the United States spends over $1 trillion on welfare programs, Medicaid, food stamps, what's the one, the Earned Income Tax Credit. I mean, all these programs add up to something like $1 trillion, which would be 5.4% of the gross domestic product and 15% of all taxes. The federal government spends $600 billion more than it collects. Well, this past year it spent $600 billion more than it collected in taxes. I suppose if you spent a couple of days searching that internet, you could figure out how much all the states ran up their debts in the last year. I gather some states have a balanced budget requirement in their constitution, But when you think of all these municipal bonds, all these deficits that state governments run, who knows? It could be easy be 1,200,000,000,000 or something. And the debt, which is the total amount that's accumulated, is federal debt is 20.2 trillion, or 105% of the gross domestic product. And who knows what the total amount of the state and local debts are. The interest is 276 billion, or 6.8% of all federal expenditures. And I wouldn't doubt that it would be double that amount if we took in all the debts of all the other, and that would be 12%, over 12% of the revenue. Now, of course, interest rates have been so low that it's been pretty easy for them to pay it. Well, what about when interest rates catch up with inflation? And when these interest rates fell, there was no inflation that year. They went from, the prime rate of interest went from about 6% to 3%, and there was no inflation that year. So now inflation's 2.5% or something. What are they going to do when they finally realize, oh, gee, nobody's going to lend money if they're losing? Now the House bill, which is the one that actually passed, but of course it has to be, what is the word, reconciled? Reconciled, so God knows what it'll look like when they're done with it. But it is going to collect $1.5 trillion less in 10 years, which to me is meaningless because all I want to know is for 1 year. But it's $150 billion less a year, and that doesn't seem very logical, that you'd want to lower taxes and increase expenditures. Corporate tax rate goes from 35% down to 20%. For 5 years, any new equipment can be written off. Well, that's okay. Why should we be taxing people on what equipment that they buy in the first place? Money brought home goes from 35% down to 12%.
You mean like income?
No, the money corporations bring
Bring home the profits that they bring home.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you. So
Small business?
that I wondered what was why the slide wasn't advancing, and I didn't see that. So small business apparently pays 39.6%, and they'll only pay 25%. Now, Rodney probably knows the answer to this. That's because they're not paying a corporate income tax. That's because they're not paying a personal income tax and the small business tax, right?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Yeah, most small businesses like an S corp,
Yeah.
applies to pass through, you were taxed at individual rate.
So they're paying a 40% rate, but that's it. There's no tax on the tax.
And that's assuming you're making enough to be at that tax bracket.
Oh, right.
You have to
Okay.
understand, it's based on how much you made, not, it wasn't 39%.
It wasn't of all income. Okay, got it.
Even the corporate
Thank you.
tax.
That's just the highest tax bracket
Right.
there. They
Oh,
call-
okay.
they
For
call
small
that
businesses.
They call that small business.
Yeah. Well, I guess a small business is up to 100 employees, something like that.
It's
Quite
income
large.
based.
Pardon me?
It's income based. Like the corporate tax rate, that's
Yeah.
the 35% is only in certain situations, but the corporate tax brackets are graduated. It goes
Oh,
up
are
and
they?
down and up and down. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
It
Thank
starts
you.
around $1 million and then again around
But
100 million.
both are based on income.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I appreciate
If you
that.
have a small business and you make them very little money, you're probably not going to pay much
Pay
tax.
any
And it's
tax.
after deductions, the income
Yeah.
after deductions.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking deductions or expenses.
It's after expenses.
Expenses,
But
but
there are some deductions.
and there are also deductions.
Yeah, your,
Okay.
your tax credit.
Rodney actually has to pay corporate taxes.
I did. Not anymore.
Beverly probably paid him too. Huh?
Corporate tax?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I figure anybody who's got a serious business. Now, the estate tax, it will be 5.5 million, and that's up. They're raising it. It's over 5.5 million, and they're going to raise it if they get their way to money that's more than 11 million
Per person.
per person. But then if there's two people, and maybe you can straighten me out on this one, if there's two people who die together, their estate pays is exempt for up to 22 million.
That's what they're saying.
Yeah, I mean, because when I read that is for if it's a per couple, I'm being a couple. Wait, most people die one at a time, but there's no estate until they both die or something. Huh?
No,
Some
no,
are planning
it's for
ahead.
each one, if they die like a year apart.
Yeah.
And they've done any planning at all, what, half of it goes to one, half the other, but it's joined together, so.
So if it's joined together, it's
The first one
22.
only uses up 4 million of it, the other one has the 11 to play with right now.
Yeah.
And then now that'll go from 4 to 20.
Okay, so it's the combined value of the estate.
It's rare earth, rare air up there.
Right. Okay, that's very good. Now, after 2024, there's not going to be any estate tax. I don't care if you're Bill Gates and you leave $100 billion, and if they get their way, starting day one, there's no alternative minimum tax. So if you find enough loopholes, you can get out of paying any tax, I guess.
Only for individuals, right? They didn't do that for corporations.
Right, alternative minimum
Okay.
tax.
I don't
Alternative minimum tax.
know about.
In essence, on the individual.
Yeah, I that makes sense.
And the
Now,
intent was
some
to-
people claim that for the first 5 years, if this tax was to pass, that 92% would pay less or the same. But after 5 years, in 2023, 40% would pay less. I guess they're the high incomes, high wealth. 20% would pay more, and 40% would pay the same. Charitable deductions are still in. Mortgage interest up to $500,000 can be deducted, but it used to be up to $1 million. Now, who the hell would pay $1 million in interest?
No, it's not $1 million in interest, it's interest on $1 million mortgage.
Okay. Interest on $1 million, but now it's only interest on 500,000. Okay, thank you. This is lucky I have the right people here. About 30% of filers itemize, and most people who itemize deduct state and local taxes. So, only real estate tax is exempt, and I assume this time it is up to $10,000, or not real estate up to valued at $10,000. In this case, I got it right. Okay, great. All right. So, anybody want to make any more comments on this?
Makes a big difference if you're on the coast or in the heartland, red territory or blue.
Red or blue? Well, if you're in red territory, the majority of people are impoverished, right?
Well, and the land values are low.
And the land values are low. The real estate values are low.
Yeah. Services are probably, that's it.
But so I saw a thing on the news before I came over, and they were saying, well, boy, these people along the coast in California and so on, and New York and New Jersey, oh man, they pay, you might pay $20,000 in real estate taxes, and they can only deduct up to $10,000. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, but they're probably pretty wealthy if their real estate tax is $12,000. What's their real estate worth?
And it's only a deduction,
Pardon me?
and it's only a deduction.
Yeah, it's not a credit or anything that they're
And if
losing.
they're making that much money, the other thing is gonna fall into effect anyway, and they're going from a 35% to a 20%, so.
Yeah, it's not the way these people were talking on their news, like, oh my God, it's the end of my world. So, but it's not going to affect, 90%, let's guesstimate, of the people in America whose real estate taxes would not be $10,000 a year.
Mortgage interest, where's mortgage interest in this? Because
Well, that's what I was saying, mortgage interest up to a mortgage of, you're saying up to a mortgage of 500,000. But it was up to $1 million.
Yeah.
And let's face it, not too many people have a mortgage of more than $500,000,
Except in the blue states.
except in the blue states,
Yeah.
and except people who were pretty well off.
Well, a lot of this runs into how I think people misunderstand the whole nature of just what an income tax deduction is. And, you know, I would run into it on a smaller scale myself from things I've done over the years, claiming sales rep deductions on various things, and I had all these people saying, you know, people would say to you, oh, you're so lucky you get to deduct all of this. Yeah, but you see, I have to pay for it first. And that's
Oh, that little catch, huh?
and so, you know,
And
I
it's
think,
not always guaranteed that it's
Right.
all deductible either.
and it isn't, but that's another story.
There's
But
percentages and all that kind of stuff.
even on the mortgage interest on the older figure of $1 million, like 5% of $1 million is $50,000, and even at that point, if you're in the highest tax bracket, you're talking what, 20 grand in your pocket? If they, you know, if they kept all of it, and if they reduce it by half of it, you're talking about 10 grand in your pocket. And so I think a lot of people misunderstand that that 10 grand that you're going to pay. Most of the people who are in that position, it'll be 10 grand. We're not talking putting food on the table for these people, you know, at their level, right?
Right.
But the one thing that's interesting is you have to think that just because someone pays 5 state and local taxes, and because they can afford an expensive building, because they're being paid more for the area they live in, you're not going to get someone to come to work for $50,000 a year when the average home is $1.5 million.
Right.
So yes, these people are making a lot of money, but their costs are also, on a percentage basis, probably that much higher.
Mhm.
Transportation costs are higher, lots of time food costs are higher, certainly trying to pay for kindergarten in New York City and paying.
Oh.
So when you look at it, it's not the fact that necessarily they're horrifically well off compared to other people in other situations, because really cost of living is the big impact upon those wages. And so if you're not taking that into account, and you're just looking at the dollar amount of the cost of the house or what they make, that really skews the viewpoint. So that's the question, you know, and so there's where people who do live in, you know, less expensive areas and don't have high taxes, don't have great services, you know, they're not going to use this damn deduction anyway.
Well,
You know?
I'm
And
in
that's the
complete
problem.
agreement with what you say. I was thinking about that the other day when they were talking. The people down south where they have low taxes were complaining. Gee, oh, you have high taxes and you get to take that off your income. Yeah, but we have high wages too. So I'll bet you that the people in New England and New Jersey, even after all their deductions, are paying a lot more federal income tax than the people down in Alabama.
Well, they not only pay more in federal income tax, the states in the South take more money from the federal government.
Oh,
than
to
the
be
states
to
that
be
are
sure they do.
in. So if you wanted to say, hey, you really want to balance the field, then say, gee, if New York City, if the state of New York is paying 15% of all federal money, shouldn't they get 15% of all that federal money back again?
Yeah,
If
if
Alabama's
if-
paying 1%, give them 1%.
if they
But
had-
that's not how society works.
If-
And that's the kind of skewed
Yeah.
argument that people use.
If they had their way, we'd say, okay, we'll make sure that that per person you'll get the same money from New Jersey as you get from Mississippi, et cetera, and we'll spend the same amount in Mississippi that we spend in New Jersey.
And so this is the point, you know, the whole point of the tax system is
Yeah.
to, in essence, support a society. You know, the cost of civilization is in essence taxes, you know. And so this is what makes me crazy, is when people are pointing figures at who has it better or worse, you can make yourself crazy with
Would there ever be a highway through Arizona if the people in Arizona had to pay for it?
You know, as we were driving, I was thinking of, you know, these roads are pretty nice.
Mhm. Yeah.
And they were.
Yeah.
Well, the federal highway system.
No, we were below.
Yeah, but the federal highway system, which truly was.
I was gonna
first-
say,
Yeah, but the
They
federal
can
hi-
some tax dollars.
but the federal highway system,
Say
that
this
was
is
put into
delicious.
place, in order to really support the military.
Right.
Yeah, granted that states paid in, but many states could not afford to put up the kind of money that the government could. And so a lot of states and a lot of cities were connected in ways they could never afford it otherwise, if it wasn't for the fact that
Yep.
on a federal level, we could afford to do this.
And maybe we didn't need a highway through the Mojave Desert or the Sierra Desert.
I say, let them have it.
And you're willing to pay for it.
Yeah, China can have it this much.
All right, so before we try to reform taxes, let us talk about the distribution of wealth.
And one thing, that last one was strictly just the program, the House.
Yes, it was.
yes,
And-
it was not the Senate.
So, as you say, it'll have to be reconciled, and we're pretty sure it won't resemble that one by the time it is.
The Senate
Or it
is
might, or the House,
not-
or the Senate bill might be the one that's reconciled, in which case we wouldn't recognize it either from what they were talking about today. So let's talk about the distribution of wealth, and then we can see how taxes affect it. So what determines wages? How much of what's produced goes to the people who produce it? Here's my model. Human exertion, mental and physical, applied to the natural resources. We combine them, we separate them, we change them in form or in place. First, we produce the capital wealth, which buildings, machines, inventories, which we use to give our labor a greater efficiency in producing food, clothing, shelter, automobiles, televisions, which we store, transport, trade, and finally put in the hands of the ultimate consumer. So anything that gets a natural resource to the consumer in the desired form is part of production. I got that one down pretty bad, but I can't remember anything else. All right, so labor and capital are the active factors, the productive factors. You can build more buildings, you can build more, make more machines, accumulate more supplies. Their value is relative to the cost of reproduction, so the return to capital will tend to be whatever is necessary to induce the storing up of capital. However, land, of course, is different. Can you make any more land? And by land, we mean,
The entire material universe excluding man and his body.
there you go. So the airwaves and the minerals in the ground that are unmined are all what we're talking about.
Water.
Water, yeah. How about that?
People seem to not
What did,
think that
what,
water-
I keep thinking when somebody
that's
says
land
that,
too.
what did Mark Twain say about water? He said, whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting over. So the value of land has to do, since it can't be produced, has to do with its advantage, measured by its advantage. Are all wages equal to the total amount that each worker produces? I mean, here's a hypothetical territory, and there's excellent fertility, good fertility. But so if you were to produce on, well, let me just say it another way. Suppose that in Wilmington, a person with their tools and equipment could produce $36 a day. And down in Dover, the same amount of work, the same value of tools, equipment, supplies would produce $32 a day. And along the Delaware River, you could produce $28 a day. And in Kent County, $24. And in western Sussex County, not along the beach, you could produce $20 a day. How much of what you produced in each of these places could you keep? What would be your wages? Can't answer, can you? It's unanswerable until we come up with something like this. Now, there's free land. And as long as there's free land where you can go and you can produce food, clothing, shelter, then you would not work for someone else Or let me turn it around. Would you work for someone else unless they offered you more than you could produce working for yourself? No, nobody's going to do that. So that's kind of like a principle, an axiomatic principle. So you can get in wages from any landowner as much as you could have produced on the land that is free, where you can produce and keep what you produce. And what happens to your wages as the free land extends to less potentially productive land?
You get the sound from Antiques Roadshow where it went down.
Yeah, I've seen that where the guy they were doing a rerun and they give you what when the show first aired, what it was worth, and then 5 or 10 years later they say, and this is what it was worth today, and you go, oh my God, I thought antiques always went up in value. All right, so wouldn't the same thing apply to the return on buildings, tools, machinery, supplies, what we're calling capital? Nobody's going to pay you significantly more than you could produce, than your capital would yield where the land is free. So it's the same idea, isn't it? Whatever your labor, whatever your capital will yield where the land is free, that's what anybody else would have to pay you to produce on their land, superior land. If you don't work today, can you work tomorrow twice? It would be nice if you could. You could, I'll just take a day off and then I'll work twice tomorrow. Well, wouldn't the same thing be true of your capital? You couldn't use it twice tomorrow. I mean, I guess you could use it 3 shifts in a row, but you couldn't use it for 6 shifts now. Same idea. And how about the longer your capital sits idle, the more obsolete it becomes, because we're constantly finding new and better ways to produce things, more efficient capital. So you can only demand from the landowners what your productive products will yield where the land is free. And the difference between what you can produce where the land is free and the greater results on superior land goes to the owners of the land. Now, one thing that I think is very deceptive, and probably I never thought to emphasize this before, if the land sits idle, of course, there really is no rent, is there? It's just sitting there, there's no rent. And if you've only got half as much capital and half as many people working on the land, you can't maximize the rent. You're not going to get the full potential of the land. And in rare cases where the land is overdeveloped, you put too much capital on it. What's the quintessential example of that everybody likes to cite as overdevelopment? Starting in 29, 30? Must have been 1930. The empty state building?
What, New York?
New York, yeah. I forget what, it was started before the crash on Wall Street, but it was finished after the crash. And of course they were striving as a monument to the tallest building. In fact, they redesigned it or something so they could beat the Chrysler building, you know, who added a few stories or something. But apparently it was 20 years before they started getting any return on their investment, because they had overdeveloped it and it cost so much more to build it per square foot of floor space that they made a big mistake in terms of an investment. And I gather that for a long time, they made more money off the observation tower than they did from the office space.
Probably still do.
And maybe still do.
One place he
Charge
said.
a lot of money to go up there.
I suppose the World Trade Center didn't have to worry about that because money was being siphoned from the Port Authority. Wynn probably knows the particulars. It's funny because she knows everything else, it seems like. She knows an awful lot, let's put it that way. Whenever all my friends with a PhD, if I don't know something, I can't understand why they don't. How could you not know that? You have a PhD?
Hierarchy.
That's apparently so. All right. So here I have it in a simple subtraction equation, and there's the different grades of land And if I can go to the free land and I can produce $16 every day, then nobody is going to work for less than $16 a day on the superior land, and the rent is the difference. 36 minus 16, 32 minus 16, and so on. Now, what if we have a national sales tax? In fact, I think that's about what some of these conservatives would really like, is a consumption tax. And they would say, well, we'll share it with every level of government, and we'll tax everything at 25%. Okay. So we have a 25% sales tax, which simply diminishes the result of production by 25%. And here, where the land is free, after the tax, $12 per day results. So wages and interest go down to $12 a day. And the rent is diminished from 20 to 15 and so on. And whenever I hear people talking about taxes and how it diminishes wages and it's horrible for capitalists and just kills jobs because it taxes capital and so on, I think, well, that would be true if we had a free land alternative. 150 years ago we did. How about if we just tax income at 25%? Be exactly the same thing, wouldn't it? Hey, we leave production alone, but we take wages and interest and we take 25% away from it, and then we take 25% away from the rent, and we get exactly the same thing. So basically, the difference in these taxes has to do with graduations, deductions, and tax credits. It's not the concept of taxing income or taxing wealth. And getting ahead of myself here. Let me go on. Is there any free land out there?
Nope.
None at all, is there? All right. So now what happens to wages when there's no alternative way to employ yourself? And of course, I'm very lucky here because every one of you have been through all this before. And some of you have been through it 100 times. So you have no way to employ yourself. What are your choices? Work for someone else. Or if you can afford to pay them rent in advance or even share crop or something like that, pay them a portion of what you produce in rent, you can do it. So the least productive workers, the least skilled, least educated people get a bare subsistence. What about the skilled workers? Why do they get paid more? You have no way to employ yourself. So why would anybody have to pay you more?
Basic supply and demand at that point, if you're in short supply.
Yeah, unless there's an abundance of skilled workers and then nobody cares. The landowners who want to hire you are going to compete for you because they know that if they have you working for them, they're going to be able to produce a lot more than if they have just these lowest level of worker. And so as the superior workers get paid more, what does that do to the incentive to learn the skills and accumulate the knowledge? It starts to go up. And so the supply starts to meet the demand, and when it does, then that's when wages of the superior workers stops going up.
Or it becomes something else that they want.
Say again?
Or it becomes a different skill that they want.
People might change their skills.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, people change their skills. And of course, I remember when computer programmers were making $100,000 a year. Unfortunately, too many people learned how to program computers, and it started to come back down, didn't it? And so ultimately, the reason some people are paid more than others is, as Rod said, supply and demand for each exact type of knowledge and skill, and the difficulty of learning it is what ultimately keeps some wages higher than others. So wages tend to an amount below which productivity would fall. This would apply to the skilled workers and the unskilled workers, right? If the skilled workers who are getting a lot more money don't get paid as much, they start getting paid less, then the supply of those workers falls, productivity falls because you have a shortage of supply and you don't have the incentive to work harder and smarter, and it starts to fall. And so that's why I say tends to an amount below which productivity would fall. And that's to say that productivity would fall even more than wages, and when that happens, what happens to the value of the rents of land?
Decrease.
It goes down. And that's the one thing the landowner doesn't want. So he'd rather give it to you than lose even more than he's going to pay you in extra wages. So what about taxes on those superior workers? If I raise Beverly's, Beverly's making $100,000 a year, and right now we're taxing her at 25%. And she seems to be perfectly happy to take home $75,000 a year. And now we raise her taxes to $50,000 a year. And what happens to the incentive to her greater skill? Oh, I'm only taking home 50? Hey, I'm not, I don't have the incentive to do that. And nobody else wants to learn her particular skill. So, of course, her employer says, whoa, we're going to have to pay her 150 so she can take home 75. And now everything is working just as way it did before. But then let's say that Beverly goes ahead and gets together with all her other highly technically skilled workers and says, I'll tell you what, Joe Biden, we'll vote for you and we'll support your campaign, and if you don't get our taxes back to 25%, we're going to work against you next time. Oh man, so Biden goes to work and he gets everybody's taxes back to 25%. Now what happens to the supply of these guys that, like Beverly who are grossly superior? At 150,000, at 100 and what would it be? 25% away from 150, 112,500 or something. Suddenly the supply of her skill and knowledge starts to go up, and the wages go down, don't they? And now, in a relatively short period of time, she's back to taking home $75,000 a year because that's the magic number that creates the supply and equal to demand. And if we lower taxes, the same thing goes up. So taxes on higher paid workers come out of what would otherwise go to rent. Now, the people at the bottom, we can see that their wages tend to this bare minimum, below which productivity would fall. Well, in the case of the people at the bottom, they get weak, they start producing less, and what happens to the rent? It goes down, though. All right, so what do we do? What did we do in 1935, I guess?
Feed them.
Pardon me?
Feed them.
Freeze them. Well, yeah.
Feed.
I mean,
Feed.
feed them. Yeah, yeah, we did that in 19.
traded federal
Yeah, I guess that started in 32, or probably started in 1930 to feed the soup lines and so on.
started
But
federal programs, right? So
pardon me?
We started federal programs to employ the people.
Yeah, well, that's true. I was thinking of the minimum wage, and I think that was passed in 35.
Oh, okay.
Um,
That was the year.
If I have the wrong date, that could explain why you didn't know the answer. But anyway, the minimum wage is what I was thinking of. And so we institute minimum wage, 8-hour day. You got to pay people overtime if you work more than 8 hours. And Social Security was what, 37 or something. And a lot of interventions that forced, like forced Social Security deductions, and your employer has to pay it too. So in a sense, that tax is no different than minimum wage, raising the minimum wage. So all these things that that intervene through legislation and raise wages. Now, it's true, we can raise wages today, and then next week we can raise taxes and take it back. And I would suggest that that's exactly what we do with wage taxes. So Wilmington's got a wage tax. It's probably not that much, is it? 2% or something? Oh, maybe. But Philadelphia is one of the highest ones, and it was like over 3%, I believe, isn't it? Something like that. So the minimum wage is not $7.25 in Philadelphia. It's $7.25 minus 3%. So clearly, that's a tax that falls on minimum wage workers, and sales taxes that are levied on anything that minimum wage workers buy. And certainly down south, they tax food and clothing. And that's so, they're paying a lot more in taxes than minimum wage workers are in the north. But of course, the cost of living is so much lower down south that it all washes out. Nonetheless, that's true. And basically anything that minimum wage workers buy that is taxed does lower wages. How about, what's different about a tax on alcohol? And minimum wage workers probably buy plenty of it, and cigarettes too.
Well, it's voluntary. You know,
Well, yeah,
it's
it's sort of.
You don't have to drink, you don't have to smoke. It's
That's
not
true.
a-
You don't have to.
Yeah.
Well, you do have to eat though.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's true. And in fact, I'm told that these are sin taxes to discourage you from smoking and drinking and so on. But it doesn't seem to work very well. But the thing I wanted to get at, and in addition to what you said, was that if you buy a $2, I don't even know if you can buy a bottle of wine for $2 anymore. No, that's all gone. That's I'm living in the past.
You can get a glass.
But maybe you could buy a cheap bottle of wine for $5 or $10, huh?
Maybe.
But if you let's say that you can buy a cheap bottle of what they used to call Sneaky Pete, white port or red port for $10, and you buy a bottle of that fancy stuff for $200. The tax is what?
Same.
The same. So it's on the volume, and cigarettes and gasoline would be the same. And I would guess a fair percentage of minimum wage workers have an old car, and they get to work and back in the car. So these are what we call regressive taxes. And they do, and taxes on them do lower the minimum wage and do lower all wages. And somewhere I had a note, and I'm afraid I either I missed it or it's going to come up later. But a lot of people have this illusion, well, I earn $10 an hour, and the minimum wage is for people earning $7, so it's got nothing to do with me. Right? I mean, you've probably heard people think that. But obviously, if somebody's making $10.25 an hour right now, and the minimum wage is $7.25, and they raise it to $3 to $10.25, and you've been working harder and smarter, you got some skill, what are you going to say to yourself if everybody else is getting $10.25 now?
I want more.
I want more, or I'm going to just do as much work as that guy. So I don't care if you're making $10,000 a year. Still, that minimum wage, when it goes up, you're going to have some incentive, or you're going to say, well, yeah. Or it might be true that you would have worked for less anyway. But one of the two. So it clearly does affect everybody. Now, for all of its shortcomings, public, and I'm sure you can probably think of a lot more of the things like maintenance and management and all that of public housing. But it certainly does prevent the landlords from taking every increase in the minimum wage, which clearly they would do because there aren't enough houses for every family. There may be enough houses, there might even be more houses, but they're not available. They're not up to the highest bidder to rent. And so nobody wants to be on the street. So if you raise the minimum wage and everything else stays the same and all housing is in the free market, then it just gets sucked up because everybody's willing to pay whatever they can afford not to be on the street. So for all its shortcomings, public housing clearly helps to keep the minimum wage, help me with a word here,
Helps to have buying
from
power.
from lowering everybody's standard of living to that bare subsistence. But the bulk of taxes are on higher wages, and they have to be compensated with yet higher wages, higher wage workers, and they have to be compensated with even higher wages so as to keep the incentive to learn the skills and to work harder and smarter. Now, to finish up with this, only people on the minimum wage and only taxes that are levied on people at the minimum wage actually are lower wages. And I would say, given the earned income tax credit and the fact that there's no income tax on somebody who's earning minimum wage, and especially if you have dependents or anything like that. So the bulk of taxes are paid out of what would otherwise go to the owners of land. And I'm not saying that all these rearrangements don't increase the taxes on one landowner and decrease them on another landowner. That's quite possible. But certainly these taxes come out of one landowner's pocket or another, not the workers and producers, with that small exception of taxes that are paid by the people on minimum wage or taxes that are increased on the people who are earning minimum wage. Now, anybody want to say anything before I go on? Am I doing all right here? All right, so, and you've been through this drill before. Here we're starting over to see how we got where we are. And our first settler comes and he walked back and forth across, after he got across the mountain, he walked back and forth looking for one place that's better than any other place. He was embarrassed by the richness and the sameness, and he got tired of looking, and he just staked out a couple 100 acres and built himself a little shelter and planted a crop and started to live happily ever after, although he was in a state of solitude and he had to be a jack of all trades because what he couldn't produce himself, he had to do without or take a long journey back to the nearest community. And another settler comes up. Lindsay comes along and says, Beverly, hey, boy, it's funny finding you out here. Oh, man. Wow, is that your cabin? And is that your crops that are growing there? Yeah. Well, what makes them yours? And you would say,
I planted them.
yeah. I mean, that's the basic argument, isn't it? I built that house, I planted that crop, and she would acknowledge they are the fruits of your labor and you are 100% entitled to them, and you would never have produced it if you couldn't keep it for yourself, would you? So then she says, but Beverly, I notice you staked off a couple 100 acres of land. Surely you are not claiming to have made the earth. And she says, but I claimed it. I was the first person, nobody else even knew about it. And I just, I was the first person to claim it. And Lindsay says, yeah, but if claiming something made it yours, I would have claimed the earth and a lot of stars too while I was at it. All right. So where does Lindsay want to be? I mean, she could grab a piece of land up here or somewhere or over here. But where does she really want to be?
Right next door.
Right next door. So that they can work together on certain projects, they can trade, et cetera, et cetera. And so Lindsay says, if you'll acknowledge this 200 acres is mine, I'd be glad to acknowledge that 200 acres is yours, and we'll cooperate, we'll share, and so on. And if anybody comes along and transgresses against either one of us, we'll stick together. Now we have title to land. And all that title to land does at this point is make sure we can keep what we've produced. Nothing more. It doesn't give us an advantage over anyone else because there's land up here that's still free, land down here is still free. It's of equal quality. And the third settler comes along, and it's the same deal, isn't it? So again, the land is just as close to the river, just as fertile, no advantage. Until, oh, and I should say, so the only thing that title to land gives you is this right to keep what you produce. And the point is that nobody would plant a crop or build a house without title to land because they couldn't claim it as their own. And it doesn't start to give an advantage until all of the land of the best quality is gone. This land might be just as fertile, but it's got a swamp between it and the river, so you're impeded in trading, and now it's less fertile and less fertile yet. All the land to the left of this line is already taken up, and the free land is to the right. And about that time, Kathy, who was the first settler who got here, had an unfortunate event. Lightning hit her cabin. She just got out of there with the clothes on her back. She's right back where she started when she first discovered the place a decade ago. And she's in a deep state of depression. And she says, oh, man. And about that time, she gets a letter. And her uncle left her his entire estate. I'm out of here. All right. So, Kathy, are you just going to say, oh, all right, anybody wants this land, help yourself?
Sure.
It's good land, but, you know, I don't need it anymore. I'm rich. Well, about that time, Tom, Dick, and Harry show up at the frontier. And she says, you know, guys, I got a lot better land than that. That's mediocre in fertility. My land is excellent. And it's right along the river, so you can trade with the greatest of ease. And why don't you guys make me an offer? So we put some numbers here, and we say that on average, this land will yield $9 a day, and this land will yield 8 because of the swamp, and 7 because it's less fertile, and 6 because it's even less fertile. And Tom wants to make her an offer, but Tom's below average. He can only produce half of what the average person can produce, and so $3 an hour on the free land and $4.50 on the best land. So the most he could offer would be $1.50 an hour, and he's certainly going to say something less to make it worth his while. And Dick is the average worker, and he could produce 6 or 9. He could offer up to 3, but he's going to say $2.90 to make it worth his while. And, all right, $2.90. And Harry can produce double the average, and he could produce anything up to 6. But if the next highest bid is $2.90, what's he going to say? $3. Okay, so he produces $18. He pays $3 in rent, and he keeps $15. That's more than 12, isn't it? So the most productive people can always outbid everybody else and get control of the best location. That's reality. You're a really good salesman. Yeah, you could go to the free land. There ain't nobody out there. Who are you going to sell to? You want to be in the city where you got those potential customers. And you're going to make a whole lot more money in the city than you are out there. Or at any other occupation. Now, let's turn it around and say, who went west when there was free land out there? Was it the skilled craftsman, the college graduates, or the young adventurer? Nothing to pay in rent. Whatever you produce is yours. Keep it all. And about this time, our second settler, Lindsay, she says, I'm old now. I'm ready to retire. You guys, you know, you guys. And she goes to Dick, and she says, Dick, you can produce $6 a day where land is free on your own land if you choose to develop it, but you can produce $9 a day on my land. How much of that 9 would I have to offer you to get you to bring your tools and equipment and come over and produce on my land? And obviously,
That's the supply and demand that dictates that.
yeah, true, exactly. And so, isn't she going to say? He's going to say, you got to give me something more than 6, otherwise I'll stay where I am. So again, 9 minus 6 equals 3. And so whether you turn the coin, what's the land worth? What do I have to pay in wages? It's 2 sides of the same coin. And here it is in the graphic, 9876. And wages and interest are going to be equal to what you can produce where the land is free. And the rent is going to be the difference, 3, 2, 1. Now, the population increases and the frontier extends to the next best grade of land. Oh, wages and interest go down. But what becomes possible when people come together in a community that's not possible when our first settlers there alone?
They can produce more.
They can produce more by
Trading.
by cooperating. You know, 2 people can build a house more than twice as fast as 1 person, as you probably found out. You hold the rafters together and so on. And eventually you get enough people where one group can grow food, another can make clothes, a third can build a shelter. And by cooperation, everybody is producing far more than they would have produced if they all produced their own food, clothing, and shelter. And they can accumulate tools and machines for each facet of each production. And I guess you'd say producing economies of scale. So the wages and interest, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So there's what it would be, except that because of cooperation, productivity doubles. And so now on less potentially productive land, because the frontier extended, we can produce more because of the cooperation, because of the subdivisions of labor. And so wages and interest go from 6 to 10, and the rent goes from 3 to 8 on the best land. 18 minus 10 is 8, 16 minus 10 is 6, and so on. And inventions like the reaper and the thresher and the steam engine, and of course, if we start thinking about the United States and the way it developed around the 1870s, we've got places like Colorado in the interior with all these natural resources, minerals that we can mine, and we've got wheat in Iowa, and corn and grows really well in Kansas, and potatoes in Idaho, and we can send them to the east and the west, and the manufacturing centers can send farm equipment and mining equipment back to the sources, and productivity increases. And on a local level, we can build a bridge across the river and the swamp, and connecting the agricultural community to what was once the most desirable agricultural land, but is now the center of a little village with a blacksmith shop and the general store, the post office, and the veterinary clinic. And productivity doubles again. The capital is now in buildings and machinery instead of farm implements, but it's still much greater. And what does that do to the demand for land? More materials to make machines out of, and farm tractors can utilize many times as much land, and people like to eat beef, and even though it requires 5 times as much land to grow beef as it does to grow cereal. So what's that do to the demand for land? It increases it, and so the frontier extends. But again, the increase in productivity more than compensates for the extension of the frontier, and wages and interest are going to have to be equal to 16, because that's what you can produce where the land is free, and the rent goes from 8 to 20. Now let me go back over oh, go ahead.
I was just, so in this scenario, the people working on that most productive land, they don't own it. Someone else still
All right, somebody else
that
owns it.
land.
Yeah, that's, I got to say it that way, otherwise I'd lose the
Right.
argument.
But if they were able to own the
If they were able to own it,
then
they would be fine.
paying
And in
rent.
fact, let's just take
Like the rent.
Kathy and let's take Lindsay and Beverly. They were the first two settlers there, and they do own the land. And they say to themselves, "Gee, when I first got here, I had to work hard with all my tools and equipment. I got $9 a day." But now, because of the increase in population, all the inventions, the infrastructure that has been built, the same labor and capital produces $36 a day on that land. It's now a village. And if I work it myself, I get to keep all 36. But if I get somebody else to work it, I give them 16 and I get 20 just because I own the land.
Okay.
Ta-da! Right? So if our first settler had it to do over again, how much land would they take? Everything you can get your hands on, right? And I'm sure they did. And of course they would say, and rightfully, well, I'm going to have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. You know, they're going to need a place to live and to work. And that's true. But they're also thinking, and so is everybody else going to need a place to live and to work. And why wouldn't I want to get $20 a day from every one of them who needed my land? Now, so given that people want to hold land as for a bank, like land banking, I think that's a polite way to say land speculation. So why wouldn't they take as much land as they could get? And if we just said 1 out of every 4 parcels of land was held for speculation, that would prematurely extend the frontier. Everybody here but Mike remembers drive-in movie theaters. And maybe you do even too.
Yeah, they were just closing down when I was a kid.
Right? Wilmington had 3 of them that I can remember. They had one called the Kerry Drive-In, right, Rodney? Right there by next door to the ballpark, which was another land speculation, right? Right there on Northeast Boulevard as you came into Wilmington, there was the Wilmington Speedway. There was 3 in a row, wasn't there? Oh, I forgot about that. They had stock car races, and it was a land speculation. You know, a way to get a little bit of money to pay your taxes and so on, keep everything, you know, it's not costing you anything, and there you go. And today, I was going to say there was one on 202, and there was one down at near Naaman's Tea House.
Yeah.
There might have been others, but I can't
There
think.
was one down in Newport.
Oh,
and
yeah.
One up on 202.
Yeah. So
There were tons
yeah,
of them.
there were quite a few. And today, of course, it's self-storage. And boy, every time I drive up 202 and I say, yeah, okay, and then when they're ready, they just put those things on the truck and go to the next one, go to the next place. I remember in Philly seeing a McDonald's on the back of a truck, moving it to the next, and about 6 months later, boy, they put up a big building right there on South Broad Street. And you can go to New York and you can see the surface parking lots. And this one's been there for at least 50 years. I bet we could look at the record somehow on the internet. But after about, 5 years ago, they put up this gigantic, and you think all that time they were depriving people of a place to work, or maybe apartments too. So it's not just the suburbs, and it's not just, and quite often, if you walk around New York and you're looking up instead of down, you'll see that there are lots and lots and lots of buildings which were probably the highest and best used when they were built, like 100 years ago. But now you can see, well, these buildings are old too, and you see how big they are, how tall they are. So clearly, they just never replaced them as the potential of the land became greater and greater. And occasionally, this is on 31st Street, I believe, you'll see this Old Navy, which is a few stories tall, but if you look next to it, you see a 30 or 40-story building, and on the other side, there's some pretty tall buildings. You know damn well, that isn't the highest and best use of the land. It's a placeholder. So all I've done is blot out 1/4 of every block of land, and in the process, it pushed the margin of production, the frontier, 2 blocks ahead, and wages fell from 16 down to 8. And the rent shot up from 20 to 28, from 16 to 24, and so on. All because of land speculation. It alters the distribution of wealth. And of course, this model doesn't say anything about the impediment to trade, the impediment to cooperation, all these underused and vacant sites. And so we say, okay, wages and interest go down, rent goes up. What happens when there's no free land? And to go back over the same thing roughly, the least skilled workers get a bare subsistence in the free market, and the skilled workers get whatever is necessary to have the supply reach the demand. Capital gets whatever is necessary for it to meet the supply, meet the demand. Yeah, I knew I had a slide in here. So what I've always said, when there is free land, if you have capital, and let's say the sheep are your capital, you can put them out to graze, and the difference between what you bought the land for and what you sell the sheep for, minus what you pay to the labor, the shepherd, is interest. But now we're back in the same boat again, where you have no way to employ your capital. There's no free land. So you either have to rent the land from somebody else or lend the capital to them. So wages and interest are in the same boat, or labor and capital is in the same boat. Wages and interest tend to that minimum below which the supply would meet the demand. And I've just said, well, okay, taking it together, wages and interest fall to an amount below which productivity would fall. And if that number was 3, all the rest of it, 33, 29, 20, all the rest of production goes to the owners of land and other monopolies. And this is where I thought, as I was going over this, well, what the Republicans want to do is lower taxes. And if low taxes are lowered, doesn't that increase land rent? And if land rent's going up, I say, why would I sell my land now? Every time I turn around, it's worth more. So I think it would probably encourage land speculation rather than discourage it.
But that's almost like getting Social Security at 62, 66, or 70.
Yeah. Although, if supposing it,
But
yeah,
so
that's right.
You wait for more time, so you have lost opportunity cost.
Yeah, that's good comparison. Thank you. Yeah. The more you wait, the more they offer you. Hey, what's the rush? And all the time, of course, people have no place to live or to work. And that's the basic problem. Low wages and unemployment. So we're back to our original question of how can we reform our taxes to create full employment, raise wages and productivity, eliminate the business cycle, and finance government and social programs. Now this next one is a question that I think every legislator ought to be able to answer when they want us to vote for them. And yet I have yet to meet a legislator, a person running for public office, I'll broaden it, who could give me a clear, consistent explanation of what makes something yours. And yet, isn't our tax policy supposed to somehow collect for society socially created values? I mean, they all tell you, well, you gotta have taxes. I mean, this whole society, the country would go to hell in a handbasket if we didn't have taxes. Oh, really? Oh, well, then maybe there's a way to levy them positively. But I have yet to hear anybody. What is the moral basis of ownership? What makes something yours?
You made it, you lay a claim to it.
It's pretty simple stuff, isn't it? You made it. You cook dinner, you don't think, just because I cooked it all day doesn't mean I should have any say over who eats it. You build a house just because I spent you know, the last year and a half building this house doesn't mean I have a right to it, huh? Sure. Is the land rent created by the landowner? You would certainly think so to talk to conservatives. Nope. And so is the rent socially created? Yeah. Does it therefore belong to the community? And should we tax people based on their ability to pay? Income tax, sales tax, building tax, import tax. They're all based on ability to pay, aren't they? There's only one kind of a caveat here, one exception, I would say, besides land value taxation, and that would be the gasoline tax, at least in principle. You're paying for the highway that you wear out. The more you consume, the more gasoline you consume, the more wear and tear you put on the road. So I'll make that one concession. There might be some others, but basically it's a land value tax. So what we would suggest is that taxes should be based on benefits received. And as I say, the only tax that I can think of in seriousness is land value taxation. So since you're only renting the land, will you use as much as little as possible? And won't you produce as much as possible on that land? You know, to rent something, and I'm thinking if you rented a car from Avis and you parked it in your back behind the house for the weekend, return it, everybody go, that guy's nuts. But to rent a piece of land and then not use it would be the same thing. If you didn't own it and you knew that if it increases in value, you'd have to pay more. So land speculation stops, and when the public collection of rent is applied to the entire country, enough people will migrate from those marginally productive sites into the cities that are being underused and the suburbs surrounding them, and then a lot of this land in the maybe 100 miles from cities and so on, in this, what do we say, that rural Mississippi in between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, will become free. It won't have any value. And that's where people can live and work, but probably almost no one would, because the people in and around the cities are going to have to pay the rent, and in order to maximize the productivity of the land, they're going to have to hire labor and put them to work. So there will always be that alternative, but probably it would never get overwhelmed because few people would ever take advantage of it. So free land will again be available, and I've backed the model up to the point where we introduced land speculation. Wages and interest are back up to 16, and the rent, well, let me even back up and say, wages and interest are equal to what everybody could produce with their labor and capital by taking advantage of the natural opportunities that are equally available to everyone. And the rent of land measures the advantage that landholders have over non-landowners, or owners of superior land have over owners of marginal land. The rent measures the advantage, it's socially created, and it belongs to society. And I suppose you'd say, furthermore, if we didn't take a certain amount of this rent and use it for the infrastructure, for the public services, the preservation of order, the administration of justice, and so on, productivity would probably be a small fraction of what it is today. Now, if we were to divide wages and interest into something, ratios that was plausible, I'd say that everybody gets everything that they produce individually by taking advantage of these opportunities that are equally available to everyone, directly through their wages and indirectly through their capital, and we share the rent. Now, supposing somebody comes along and invents the robots and new computers and all kinds of innovations and technological advances, and productivity doubles again. Well, we've doubled the numbers and I've extended the frontier, but even so, wages and interest are going up from 16 to 24, and the rent is going up even more, from 20 to 48, 16 to 40, and so on. So now we've got a lot more funds for the increasing needs of social growth. As populations increase, we need more infrastructure, and we've got it. We've got an increasing fund.
Why did the frontier increase in that?
Pardon me?
Why did the frontier increase in that scenario? Would the frontier decrease if you're increasing productivity?
Well, I'm saying there's no land speculation,
Oh,
but the population increases and inventions increase, and so these greater inventions are using more resources and so on.
Gotcha.
And so, and the greater population actually needs a little bit more land. But if it weren't for the extension of the frontier, I guess just increasing productivity would increase the rent, but not the way it does when you extend the frontier. And I think it's fair to say that as population increases, as invention goes on, that while without land speculation, wages and interest tend always to increase as an amount, but they constantly tend to become a smaller portion of what's produced. Even though with land speculation, wages and interest are frozen and all the increase goes to rent. But even without land speculation, more and more can be attributed to the efforts of society and less to the efforts of individuals and corporations. And so I think this stupid equation at least illustrates that. So with the single tax, would corporations gain by moving their operations to other countries? Can they take their land with them? Nope. And if they brought their money, their corporate profits back into the country, do we care? Would we tax them? No. Fine. So if they did go to some other country, it's because of some peculiarity that they're interested in, fine. And whoever takes the land, whoever gets the land from them is going to have to pay the rent. So we don't care what they do. Whereas now, they decide to go to another country. They shut the land down. Oh, nobody's going to work here. Go to North Philadelphia. There must be 50 or 100 square miles of factories that are just sitting idle and collecting trash. So with the single tax, everyone benefits from, as individuals, with higher wages and higher return on their capital. As members of society with social programs, the rent, in addition to the current needs of society, and I guess I would argue that we're not going to need as much money as we currently do, because a lot of the people who today turn to crime would have a good job and a decent life, and they would probably decide not to throw it away and end up in jail. And only the people who were physically and mentally unable to take care of themselves would need our help, and of course we could give it to them. We could take care of them out of the part of the land rent. We could pay for national health care, Social Security, medical research, developing safe energy, and as soon as we pay off the national debt, we could have a cash dividend for everybody, not as a reallocation or redistribution of wealth from the rich to the poor, but everybody would get it as a common right out of the socially created fund without in any way diminishing the incentive to work and produce and keep the wealth you produce. We're only sharing some of the socially created values. But it would be a great leveler for those who are not as smart and not as strong. Collect the rental value of land, abolish all other taxes, socialize those businesses which are in their nature monopolies, in which there cannot be reasonably be competition, like the roads, the railroad beds, the utilities, wires and pipes, and abolish all other government granted monopolies. And this, I believe, is true tax reform.